Welcome to Unit 4, first lecture here. We're going to take a look at phases of the moon. And my hope here is that you can get a decent understanding of not only how you could go outside, look at the moon, and name what phase we're in, but you also understand that the location that the moon must be in relationship to the Earth and why all these occur. So to get rolling, the Earth rotates and revolves around the sun. Check. We've covered that quite a bit, right? Well, the moon slowly rotates around as it revolves around the Earth. So it's weird, but it works out to where, and we'll get into this a bit later, one rotation of the moon is the exact same amount of time and distance it takes to make one revolution around the Earth. So consequently, we're always looking at the same side of the moon, which is kind of weird. Until we had satellite technology, no one had a clue what the far side of the moon looked like. But we get more into that a little bit later. Right now, I just want you to think back to the Earth's rotation, a counterclockwise motion, and that's going to give the appearance of like rising and setting of stars and the sun, just like the moon. So what I'm getting at here is the moon rises in the east and sets in the west, and it changes. Sometimes it's a lot earlier, sometimes it's a little bit later, but it's going to be subject to that rise in the east, set in the west as well. So since we've got the moon in motion or revolving around the Earth, and we've got all these kind of movements, celestial motions in play, we're going to see a different chunk of the illuminated side of the moon. That's a fancy way of saying how much of the bright moon we see, or that's bathed in sunlight we see, looks a bit different. And those are referred to as the lunar phases. So lunar phases, what are they? They're just the different names that are given to the different shapes that we would see the illuminated or the bright part of the moon from Earth. So there's that word lunar, and whenever we see lunar, it's just referring to the moon. It comes from the Latin root of luna. Perhaps you've heard of a lunatic. That's someone who's crazy. There used to be a belief held that the different phases of the moon could throw people into manic or crazy moods. My wife, she's a nurse downtown, and I can tell you that she's still kind of convinced that when full moon pops up, things go crazy in the hospitals. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Right now, I just need you to understand, all right, the term lunar just refers to moon. And the lunar phases, that's going to be how much of that bright chunk of the moon we see. So, if we think back to some of the crudely drawn sketches that old Mr. Cash made for you, looking at, the sun falling onto the Earth. And even as the Earth rotated, we said that, half of the Earth was always lit up by the sun. Or half the Earth is always in daytime, the other half is always in nighttime. But Cash, it changes. That's true, because the Earth rotates. Well, turns out the moon, no different. Half of the moon is always lit up, but we don't always see that full half of the moon lit up. Why? Well, because, as I just mentioned, there's things that are in motion. So we're going to see different phases or slivers or chunks of that illuminated side. But always half is illuminated. We just don't always get to see that entire half. Sometimes we do, but not always. So the phase we see really just depends on that. How much of that illuminated half are you looking at? And how much of that illuminated half you get to look at is going to be dependent on where the moon's at in its trip around the Earth. So we got our little picture here. On the right, those yellow arrows, that's supposed to represent sunlight. And then the center guy there, that's going to be Earth. And then all the way around is just the moon in different locations and how we would see them. But if you look at what's pictured here, we really kind of just see, all right, well, half the moon is always illuminated. It's the half facing the sun. That makes sense, right? So then I'm kind of looking at this, but I don't see what those different phases are, right? I mean, even little kids know, well, sometimes there's banana shape, and sometimes there's halfy half, and sometimes there's full, and sometimes the moon went dark. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. So we're going to start with the position of the moon closest to the sun. So that'd be like that middle guy, or like your 3 o'clock position. That's going to be what we refer to as a new moon, or sometimes it's called a dark moon, because we're looking at the dark side of the moon. It just happens to be the closest. So if you look at a picture here on the right, again, like that 3 o'clock position, or in the middle on the right there, that would be a new moon. That's where we're starting with the moon's journey around. And if I'm on Earth and I look up and see the moon, and the moon is between the Earth and the sun, or another way of me saying that is the moon is closest to the sun, I would just be looking at the entire dark half, none of the illuminated half. And since that's where we're going to start our trip, it's called a new moon, or sometimes referred to as a dark moon, because you're looking at the dark side of the moon. So now we're going to see that the moon starts to move, or starts to revolve, or orbit around the Earth, change its position. And here we see all the different phases, or how we would view it from Earth, where if I go back to this guy, we see the positions of the Earth, the moon, and the sun. The sun, again, is positioned at the far right here. We just see the little yellow arrows from sunshine coming through. So over the course of the next 7 days, Cash, I thought it was a week. It is. Over the course of about the next week, you're going to start to see what's referred to as a waxing crescent. That would be the top middle guy there, sometimes erroneously referred to as banana moon. It's a waxing crescent. So you've got basically 2 words there that we're going to have to go through in a little bit to understand: crescent and waxing. So if you look at the, if you look at the waxing crescent there, this term waxing just means to add light. So you're seeing more light. Think about it, if you were to wax a car. You're putting, or you're adding a protective coat over the car's paint. So as you're adding things, that's waxing. It just means you're getting to see more. We started at the new moon phase here with none of the light visible, or we're not looking at any of the visible half, illuminated half. We start to see a little bit as the moon starts to revolve around, and we get that little sliver there that we see that's waxing. The shape is a crescent shape, or perhaps you've had the flaky breakfast croissant. Croissant is a crescent shape. That just means that concave shape there, that banana shape, that bowl shape, however you want to think of it, that's a crescent shape. So the waxing tells us that we're adding light. The crescent tells us what it would look like. So we're making our way to the first quarter moon. And now we're looking at half of the illuminated half. So this would be like the far right top row, where it says first quarter. A lot of times kids will call that a half moon. There is no half moon phase. I get that half the moon that we see is illuminated, but there is no half moon phase. We're really just looking at half of the illuminated half. But if you notice here, we call that first quarter, as we've kind of made our way through this first week. The reason that it's called first quarter is because you're about a quarter of the way through the lunar cycle. So about a quarter of the way through, you have gone from new moon to waxing crescent to where you're about a quarter of the way through, and we're looking at half of the illuminated half. So first week's down. We're done about a quarter of the way through the trip. So during the next week, or like week 2 of this lunar cycle, you're going to get to see more of the illuminated half. Remember, we're adding light here, so we're in a waxing phase. That would move us to what's referred to as waxing gibbous. So the waxing, remember, that just means adding light. You're getting to see more and more. You're making your way towards that full moon. And the term gibbous, it just means rounded on both ends. So like if you look at that waxing gibbous, it's got sort of a convex shape to it, or it kind of like bubbles out on both sides. Whereas if you look at the crescent shape there, you've got kind of more of a concave shape, or like, yeah, it bubbles out on the one side, but it's sort of squished on the other. So this would be the waxing gibbous phase. And we're about, rolling up into the second week here. And at the end of that second week, we would get to where we are at a full moon. So take a peek here at the right. First picture I showed you. From here, new moon, your 3 o'clock position, according to this picture, halfway around was about a 2-week trip. And now we are at full moon. So as the moon went from this new position, or this dark moon, where we're looking at the entire dark side of the moon, we started to see a little bit. The moon's positioned here, that's waxing. So remember, we're adding light. It's got that crescent shape, so we call it waxing crescent. No, there's not a half moon. We're a quarter of the way through the trip here, right? I mean, the moon basically went from like your 3 o'clock to your 12 o'clock position. At this spot here, though, we would be looking at half the illuminated half, which, I get where some people would erroneously call it a half moon. Now we're starting to see more than half of the illuminated half, and that gives us that rounded shape on both ends. We're still adding light, so it's waxing. It's rounded on both ends, so it's gibbous, and that would look like this first moon here in that middle row, or in that second row. Wrapping up our 2 weeks, boom. Now check this out. The moon is in a position where it's farthest from the sun, or it goes moon, earth, sun. As we make our way from left to right, we get to see the entire illuminated half. And we refer that we call that a full moon. Cash, look at the way this is set up. How come the old Earth isn't blocking the sunlight from hitting the moon here? That's weird. It is. And when we get into lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, I'll explain that later. Right now, though, I just want to go through these lunar phases. And we've gone halfway through the cycle, about a 2-week deal, from new moon to full moon, or looking at none of the illuminated half to all of the illuminated half. And now we've got to kind of phase out of that, where rather than seeing all of the illuminated half, we make our way to none of the illuminated half. So obviously we've got a different term for that, right? And it's referred to as waning. Like if I said, man, come on, focus your attention, it's starting to wane, that just means going away. So waning is less visible, or we're seeing less and less over the next few nights. So we're in a waning phase, and some kids will think, oh, okay, so it goes new, crescent, quarter, gibbous, full. And they want to like memorize like crescent, quarter, gibbous, like an order or something. Remember, it doesn't like just chunk back to new and then go to full. We're at full, seeing all that illuminated half, and then we've got to gradually get rid of some of that light. So it goes from full moon back to gibbous. It's waning gibbous, though, because we're going to see less and less light over the next few nights, until eventually we do get back to that new moon. But really, gibbous, though, that's a term, right? That means rounded on both ends. The waning here is just a new term that means less. So we're rolling out of week 3, and we're headed into the home stretch here to wrap up our lunar cycle. Notice that it's called third quarter or last quarter. Both terms are appropriate. It really just kind of means third quarter, hey, you finished 3 quarters of this lunar cycle, or last quarter, you're entering the last quarter of the lunar cycle. It's really the same thing, and it looks the same. But if you take a peek at this, last quarter, first quarter, we know those aren't referred to as half moons. They're named for how far into the phase they are. Another thing that I want to kind of show you here is look at last quarter and first quarter. Some kids will say, yeah, they're the same. We're looking at half that illuminated half. Well, what's different? If you look closely, you'll see in the first quarter, you've got light on the right. And if you look at the last quarter, we've got light on the left. So those are very, very similar looking, but like basically flip-flopped, right? Or sort of a mirror image of each other there. So how the heck do you keep that straight? If I go out and I see half of the illuminated half, how do I know if it's first quarter or last quarter? The little thing I always say in my head is right more light, left leaving. And what I mean by that is if I see light on the right, I think right more light. So I know that over the next few days, I'll be seeing more and more light. That means I must be waxing phase. Or if I went out and I saw last quarter, I would think left is leaving. So I think like, well, if the light's on the left, it's leaving, I'm going to see less and less. So that would mean I have to be in the waning phases. So we're waning to where now we just see the waning crescent until eventually we get to see none of the illuminated half, bringing us back to a new moon. So in the phases we see here, there's sort of that double up of the new moon or dark moon, and that's because it's where you start, and then I guess you eventually have to stop, just kind of like on a clock, right? You know what I mean? You can go from 12 o'clock back to 12 o'clock. This whole cycle takes 29 and a half days. Man, that seems awfully similar to the amount of time in a month. It is. Just like the day is based off of a rotation, and a year, we said, is based off of a revolution, a month is based off of a moon cycle. And it takes about 29 and a half days. I get that we don't have a month with 29 and a half days, but we'll fine-tune that a bit later. So with all that being said, this should kind of make some sense now, right? On the right, the first picture I showed you, we know the sun's off towards the right, and the sunlight is making its way to the left, as seen here with these little yellow arrows, and that the moon revolves around the Earth, and as it's in different angles or positions around the Earth, we see a different chunk of that illuminated half. Half of it's always illuminated, but the only time we see that entire half is in the full moon phase. Sometimes we see none of it excuse me, I said that backwards. When we look at the entire illuminated half, we see it as a full moon phase. Sometimes we see none of it, and that would be the new moon phase. If we're making our way from new moon to full moon, we refer to that as the waxing. Remember, waxing's adding. First you see a bit, waxing crescent. Then half of the half, we're a quarter of the way through, first quarter. Then more than half, where it's going to be rounded on both ends, so that's a gibbous. We're still adding light, so waxing. And then we're into full moon. We go from full moon back to new moon. So as we're looking at the entire illuminated half in this position, we start to phase out of that, rounded on both ends, gibbous, losing light though, so that's waning until we make our way to third quarter. Man, Cash, third quarter, first quarter, how on earth would I keep those guys straight? Remember, left is leaving. So as the light's leaving from full moon to new moon, I expect to see light on the left. And if you notice here, you can kind of keep that straight, not just for your quarters, but if I go out and I see a waning gibbous or a waxing gibbous, all right, I remember they're rounded on both ends. The difference here is one has light on the right, so more light on the right, adding, that's got to be waxing. If it's on the left, left is leaving, and that's waning. And then you make your way back to new moon, and you start to lose some of that. That whole cycle taking 29 and a half days. So how did I keep some of the little cutesy stuff straight? I used to think, oh boy, I might be dating myself here with how old I am, but The Karate Kid was a newer movie when I was a youngster. The first one, there's probably like 10 of them out now, and some spin-offs on the old Netflix and the old streaming TV stations and whatnot. But anyways, this guy here, Mr. Miyagi, he used to say wax on, wax off when he was training young Daniel's son. So in my tiny brain, I'd think wax on, wane off. Okay, wax on, we're adding more light. Wane means leave, off, that's we're losing light. It'd be on the left. Because right, more light, left is leaving. Look at all those waxing phases, basically from your new to full, light on the right. Look from your full back to new, where your light is leaving, it's on the left. Left is leaving. So hopefully that sheds, I mean, no pun intended, but sheds some light on the lunar phases. If you've got questions or concerns, please reach out. Till I see you again, take care